Hey there, my name's Pastor Blake Moore. Thanks so much for checking out one of our latest messages online. And we know that you will be blessed, encouraged and inspired as you watch this message today. Thanks for checking out one of our resources, and we would love to meet you in person very soon. God bless.
When I was in primary school, we would go on these family holidays together, which usually involved packing up the old bright yellow Holden station wagon full of bulky camping gear and trekking off on Boxing Day to Port Sorell for a week, where we would set up our tent along with, it seemed to me, a fair proportion of the rest of Tasmania. Or occasionally, we would travel and camp at some interstate location that we hadn't been to before. Now, I have to be honest, my memories of camping are not all good. In my mind, those bigger interstate trips in particular play out like some primary school comedy fiction novel where everything that can go wrong does. But the one thing I do remember about my childhood camping holidays is the importance of location and where you pitch your tent. And because we went to the same location at Port Sorell for about 5 or 6 years in a row, I think, my parents would book the exact same site every year, a year in advance, and that was a priority for them. So this site was flat, it had power, it had some shade from a nearby tree, it was not too close to the road for noise, not too far away from the bathrooms for the kids. So my parents were intentional about where they pitched their tent. They didn't leave that to chance. They chose the best site based on our family's needs. And maybe that sounds familiar to some of you as well. We are continuing our series, Unfinished Story, Unfinished People, looking at the life of Abraham. We know that Abram, whom God later renamed Abraham, was a work in progress, as we all are. But today's topic, unfinished priorities, will show Abraham was a man who learnt to prioritise seeking God. In today's story, we'll also get to know Abraham's nephew Lot. And by comparing their choices, we'll see how our priorities guide our decisions, which impacts our unfinished future. And we'll even get some camping tips from Abraham, because that man knew where to pitch his tent. Let's read Genesis 13, 1 to 18. It's in your weekly update and it'll be on the screen. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier and where he had first built an altar. There, Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarrelling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarrelling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tent near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Then the Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, "Look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord. Now, just for a little bit of context, at the beginning of the chapter, we see Abraham, his wife Sarah, and his nephew Lot leaving Egypt. And they have been asked to move on from Egypt after a little bit of an awkward situation there. And if you missed last week's sermon, Blake spoke about this time in Egypt in his Unfinished Trust sermon. If you missed it, I'd encourage you to catch up on it by listening to the podcast or watching our YouTube channel. But I'm picking up a sense of unsettledness at the beginning of this chapter. Abraham was wealthy, so he was financially secure. But verse 3 says that he was moving about from place to place. And it was kind of like he was backtracking. He'd gone to Egypt. God never told him to go to Egypt, but he'd gone to Egypt and it hadn't worked out. And he was trying to get back to the place where he knew he'd heard God speak before. And that is not a bad idea, to show up at the place you know you'll meet with God. Show up where you've heard God speak before. Now, even so, even after Abraham is trying to seek God, another awkward situation arises. And this time it's between Lot's shepherds and Abraham's shepherds. Basically, they had so much livestock between them that there wasn't enough feed for all of the animals on the land. Let's look back at verse 8. It's in your weekly update if you grabbed one of those as you came in. Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarrelling between you and me or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Let's not fight. We're family. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. And if you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Our priorities reveal our motivations. Our actions or inactions reveal what's in our heart. Abram's priority is peace. He doesn't ignore the conflict, he addresses it because he prioritises the relationship. He values this relationship with his nephew more than he values financial gain. His motivation is others focused, and so he says to Lot, "You can choose. Take your pick of the best land. You can have it. But we're family. So let's separate on good terms." But Lot looked around in verses 10 to 11 and he saw an opportunity to upgrade. He set his eyes on the best land and he chased abundance. Lot prioritised financial gain because his motivation was self-focused. Now, financial gain in itself isn't bad. Abram was wealthy too, probably far more wealthy than Lot. But Lot's prioritisation of making money at the expense of being close to God would lead him in a very bad direction, and it would have dire consequences for his family. Our priorities reveal our motivations. Lot chased money. He got a taste for it in Egypt, and he wanted that life again because he was motivated by self-fulfillment. Abraham chased peace because he was motivated by relational integrity, and he was trying to seek God. What you are chasing, where you are spending your energy, what you prioritise reveals your motivations. So Lot and Abraham have separated on good terms. Let's pick up in verse 11. Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. What we prioritise reveals what's inside us, our motivations, our heart. But our priorities also guide our decision making, and there are spiritual implications for every decision we make. Let's see how that plays out in the locations that Lot and Abraham chose to go. Lot prioritised self-interest and money-making, so he decided to go east. If that's the best land, I'm having it. But also in an easterly direction were the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Obscenely sinful, wicked hotspots described in Genesis 18 as grievous to God. Grievous to God. Sodom was dead set against God's standards. So let's just watch this process unfold. First of all, Lot decided to go vaguely in that direction. He went east, chasing the good land, and he had the whole plain before him. But he pitched his tent near Sodom. It seems like he was just kind of drawn to it. He edged closer and closer, just a little bit closer to Sodom. Satan loves it when we edge closer to Sodom. Just another drink, just another look, little bit more juicy gossip to share. Now, not surprisingly, follow the process. In the next chapter, we find that Lot is in Sodom. Be careful where you pitch your tent. I cannot say this strongly enough. Be careful where you pitch your tent. There are spiritual implications to every decision we make, and Lot didn't prioritise God in his choices, and eventually he was absorbed by the sinful city of Sodom. And it started when he pitched his tent near Sodom. So what's that really about, pitching your tent? Because we're not just talking about camping anymore. Where you pitch your tent is where you establish yourself and you settle in. Now, it could be a physical place, like it was for Lot, Or it could be a mentality that you've settled into, or an opinion, or a lifestyle, or a relationship. What kind of friends or people are surrounding you and influencing you? What kind of worldview is saturating your mind? What attitudes are you hanging on to, or choices are you making that aren't godly? You see, Lot was never going to find a Christian mentor or someone with godly influence in Sodom. No, he had left Uncle Abe far behind. He was never going to have fellowship with other believers in Sodom. His children never got to make friends with other Christian kids because there weren't any. They grew up hearing and seeing sexually explicit obscenity as normal. And the last thing we read about Lot's daughters much later in Genesis is a very disturbing reflection on where Lot chose to pitch his tent. Because our choices have spiritual implications. Now, even though Lot may not have moved towards Sodom for the purpose of engaging in some obscenely sinful lifestyle, he chose not to move away from it either. He pitched his tent right next door to Sin City, and he overlooked the sinfulness of Sodom because he prioritised wealth. Our priorities guide our decision making. And if God is not a priority, then our decisions will reflect that. But what about Uncle Abraham? What's he doing through this? Where does he pitch his tent? Well, he's in the land of Canaan, where he'd heard from God before. But here's a little detail that I didn't pick up straight away. In verse 14, God spoke to Abraham after Lot had parted from him. Abraham had already called out to God earlier in the chapter, but God spoke to him once Lot was out of the picture. And I just find that interesting. And now that God had Abraham's full attention, he reiterated his promise in verse 15, all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. So Abraham pitched his tents in verse 18 near Hebron in Canaan. He pitched his tent on God's promise. He made that choice because he was obedient to God's calling on his life. And where Abram pitched his tent, there he built an altar. He made his home a place to honour God. That's what an altar is, a place to honour God. He established himself, he pitched his tent on the premise that we honour God here. Our priorities guide our decision making. Pitch your tent where God is. Now, we can't all work in a church or in a Christian environment, and we do need to engage with people who aren't believers yet. We do need to engage with people who think differently to us. Excuse me. So each of us have to decide in our own unique situation, am I influencing others for Jesus, or are they influencing me away from Jesus? Maybe it's time to move your tent. God wants us to draw near to him, not to Sodom. And Abraham wasn't a young man when he made this choice. He'd made mistakes before. We learnt about some of them last week. It is never too late to leave Sodom or Egypt or the wilderness or wherever you may be, it's never too late to leave there and move closer to where God is. In writing to the Corinthian church and also to young pastor Timothy in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says that we should run from or flee sinful situations. He says, flee from sexual immorality, flee from idolatry, flee from the love of money, flee from evil desires. Basically, run from what will pull you away from God. Because if you choose not to get out of Sodom, then Sodom can get in to you. Now let's fast forward a little bit and look at what happens next for Abraham and Lot. In chapter 14, in the next chapter, some things are going on in the region where Lot and Abraham live. Basically, there were some kings who were subject to these 5 more powerful kings who had banded together and made an allegiance. And when I'm talking about a king in these days, it's a king of a pretty small kingdom, maybe one city and a little area around it. But these less powerful kings, well, they were sick of that, so they got together and rebelled against the ruling kings. But they lost. And one of the losing kings was the king of Sodom. And by now, Lot lived in Sodom, and when the city was defeated and ransacked, they carted Lot, his family, and all of his possessions off too. Today's priorities will impact the future. Because our story is unfinished. We are unfinished people. So what we prioritise today impacts the future. When Abraham finds out that Lot has been captured, he gathers his friends and allies and he hunts down those winning kings, routing them with only about 300 men, rescuing Lot and his family and all of Lot's possessions as well as the rest of the city. When Abraham returns, the losing kings, who had run off to the hills for safety, they come out to meet him to say thank you. So what do Abraham and Lot do after this victory? What do they prioritise? How do they respond? Well, interestingly, we don't hear anything from Lot. He is absent from the next passage of Scripture, and he just kind of opts out. There's no thank you to Uncle Abraham or to God for the rescue. Thank you for protecting me, God. Our priorities, what we do and what we don't do, reveal our motivations. And as far as we know, Lot scurried straight back to Sodom. And the next time we hear about him in Genesis 19, he is a gatekeeper of the city. He's had a promotion. In contrast, Abraham does 2 really interesting things. Chapter 14:18 says, "Then Melchizedek, king of Salem," now just to note, there are 2 different places. Salem is a good place, Sodom is the bad place. They're quite different. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. Abraham acknowledged God in the victory. His response was to worship God by giving God's messenger Melchizedek a tithe, 1/10 of everything. Everyone gives their first and best to someone or something. But who or what gets your first and best depends on what you prioritise. Abraham's first response is to thank God by giving back to him. This church has a history of generosity. Most people get giving here. You get the difference between opting out, no thanks, if you're talking about giving, I'm not really here, to opting in. God, you have blessed me, and I want to say thank you. I'm opting in to being financially generous to God as a response to what he has done for me, just like Abram did. Now, if you haven't seen it, we have a special opportunity in our centenary year to be generous toward God and others. The details are in this brochure. But what if our church pitched its tent in generosity and we actually got 100% engagement in this vision? I wonder how that would impact the future. The goal is $100,000, that's a lot of money, overall, and 100% engagement. Now, if you haven't grabbed one of those, don't miss your opportunity to worship God with your first and best and be part of something significant. Now, secondly, the king of Sodom, the evil king, he goes on to offer Abraham a reward, which was standard practice in those days, to keep Sodom's goods that he had recovered from the victory. And Abraham says, no, thank you. I've got my nephew back, but you can keep your dirty money because I don't want any part of it. I do not want what Sodom is offering, because he knew where he'd pitched his tent. Abraham says in verse 23 of chapter 14, I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. So Lot chose not to prioritise God, with disastrous consequences. He went straight back to Sodom, and his wife was killed shortly afterwards when God destroyed that city and everyone in it. And Lot survived because of God's mercy, really. Lot was then forced to live in a cave, and he lost all of his wealth anyway. His daughters became the depraved people that they had grown up with. Abraham chose to seek God, to position himself to hear God. He pursued integrity, even with his dodgy nephew Lot and the free loot that he could have had from Sodom. Now, he still had hard times. He still had to grow in trusting God. He still had difficult choices to make. He still made mistakes. But his home, his tent, his posture was to honour God. Let me close this morning by finishing off my family camping story that I told you earlier. You see, every year when my family went camping at Port Sorell on Boxing Day, we went to a Christian conference there. There were national and international Bible speakers. There was a kids' Bible program for us. There were other Christian kids and families that we got to know over time. My parents eventually became part of the organising committee, the leadership team, and some of the kids who went to this camp year after year grew up and married each other. And the reason that we stopped going to Port Sorell and stopped camping, thankfully, was because the conference moved to better facilities at Camp Clayton and they had cabins, praise the Lord. You see, I didn't always like it, but I always knew where my parents pitched their tent. They weren't perfect. They weren't always able to live it out. They were unfinished, like Abram and like us. But I always knew that seeking God and becoming more like Jesus was a priority in their lives because they were intentional about where they pitched their tent. Consider where your tent is today. Now, don't pitch your tent in the past. Don't pitch your tent in regret. That's not what this message is about. Consider where you want your tent to be pitched today. Because what you choose today, what you prioritise today, can impact the future.